So in 2017, the Mountain Goats released Goths, a lengthy project and pseudo-sequel to 2015's Beat the Champ, a trilogy later concluded in 2019 with In League with Dragons. This doesn't appear to be an official trilogy of albums, but they were grouped together because of overarching similarities in approach and theme. Singer-songwriter albums exploring niche fascinations, stuff full of arcane detail that might feel a little incomprehensible if you didn't get the reference points. Yet if you did, you might find it strange that the Mountain Goats approached their scenes with sounds that didn't really seem to align with them. This was most notable on Goths, because after the absolutely fantastic Rain in Soho opener, one of the best songs of the 2010s outright, the rest of the album was lush but muted, even with touches of smooth jazz, reflective of a goth spirit required to exist in a world that wasn't so much hostile as it was uncaring. And then you got to the actual thematic through line. It was about living within a subculture that came to replace others before being replaced itself, except those in which it was life and they would do anything to hold on to it, with the dogged belief that folks will always come back, maybe a little grayer or haggard, but it'll stick around, right? Well, it's nearly 10 years later. I'm comfortable now saying that Goths by the Mountain Goats is a classic album. In the narrow race for the best albums of 2017, it's between that and Open Mike Eagle's Brick Body Kids Still Daydream, another phenomenal project that is so grounded in its sense of place and detail and understanding of the passage of time, how our environment and community let us become giant, if only for a little while, when it matters. And yet the times are a-changing yet again. And not just because Open Mike Eagle's putting out an album in a couple of days. A lot of us have lived a lot of life since 2017. And this year, the Mountain Goats have a new album. I've seen folks claim that it's their best since Goths. Honestly, if it was a return to the quality of the criminally underrated Bleed Out from 2022, I was game. But what caught more of my attention were folks describing this as a pseudo-sequel to Goths. And by that I mean John Darnielle himself describing the joke on Blue Skye of all places. What if we made that sequel to that 80s inspired album set in the 90s and call it Grunges? And the result of all that? Well, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and where we're going to talk about the Mountain Goats in days of nostalgia.
I was on the prowl for something good to do. Started up a rock band. Wouldn't you? Everybody needs his own space on the floor. Everybody needs something to be on guard for.
Alright, let's not beat around the bush. Days is going to be one of the best albums of 2026. After a relative downturn with the burrowing into lore of 2023's Jenny from Thebes and 2025's Through This Fire Across from Peter Balkan, an album I actually didn't review, mostly because I just don't think it works that much for me. The story concept doesn't really land, the hooks didn't really jump off the page, Lin-Manuel Miranda's all over the album and is actually quite good on it. It drags on a lot of awkward moments. The album just bounced off me. Not bad, but it didn't really resonate, so I skipped covering it altogether. It happens. But enough about projects that I don't think work. Let's talk about one that absolutely does. A reunion with John Congleton on production for the first time since 2011's All Eternals Deck, where he worked alongside Brandon Eggleston and Scott Salter, longtime veterans with the Mountain Goats throughout the 2000s and 2010s. There is this sharp, vibrant immediacy that shows John Congleton may have finally worked through his rough, uneven patch the past couple of years. The melodies, they gleam. The rough edges, they crack. Every weird tonal choice, like the harps from Michaela Davis, the watery and hazy yet triumphant flourishes of Annie Haslam Imperial Phase, the hammered dulcimer on Going To Fennario, the muted, pensive warping of the title track, and the contented burbles of best hard rock albums of 2013 that later builds this certain sad elegance on Woodstock 99. They just pop for me. And in that spirit, the opening track, Song for Layne Staley, feels a little too close with its thick rumbles of distortion, the booming drums, the drum fill borrowed from Smells Like Teen Spirit that's really just being lifted from the Gap Band, where the first track of the album seems to set the tone of where the sound was going. It was going to be grunge, but almost immediately after, it's kind of a similar switch up to Goths. While the nervy bass grooves are probably the strongest that they have been in years, no offense whatsoever to their longtime bassist Peter Hughes, who retired from the band in 2024, with Rob Yost filling in and contributing French horn as well. The other horns, they drawl against the brittle and choppy acoustics and the scuzzy riffs, and that's before the jauntier pianos and watery synths slip in. The heavier low end of grunge, you can argue, is there, but you hear more glimpses of the more soulful roots rock and college rock, but also the stranger mutations where rock would wind as the decade would continue, where you could slip some of these songs right into the 90s and they wouldn't sound that far afield. And you know, given how much the 90s were pulling from some of the rootsier elements of the 1970s, or some of the underground elements of the 1980s then hit the mainstream, perhaps more decades than just that. It maybe doesn't quite rip as hard as Bleed Out did, but the sheer variety of tight melodic hooks managing to lodge for me and they wouldn't let go, it's just a natural compliment to John Darnielle's unique register. It was spellbinding. And again, so many of these hooks just go off. And on that note, let's naturally talk about songwriting and themes. Because again, being initially described as a sequel to Goths, but focusing on 90s rock and culture, that sounds like the sort of thing that would be the dream of any music critic of a certain generation or demographic to examine and deconstruct. And yet I shouldn't even be surprised that it's not that. Well, not quite anyway. Mostly because there are songs like Song for Layne Staley, referencing the late frontman of Alice in Chains and his tragic story. Candlebox, referencing the mid-90s B-list act in the context of a fictional band who can't even quite measure up to them on tour. And Woodstock 99, self-explanatory. It doesn't even feel as focused or atomized to that moment or that subculture outside of a specific spread of references that aren't even just confined to the 90s. Ones where you can tell John Darnielle is both familiar, but might be a little on the outside looking in, or presenting himself as such. Snippets and snapshots diffused and a little blurry. Forget the 80s urban legend of Charlie Sheen reaches out to the feds, where he reportedly saw what he thought to be a Japanese snuff film. Haslam Imperial Phase is referencing the progressive rock band Renaissance from the 1970s, and their front woman in that era. Going to Fennario is a tribute song to late Bob Weir, the Grateful Dead, with distinct references to songs from the early 70s, down to an adaptation of a much more traditional sing-along chord structure and backing vocals. Crying on Eddie Nash's Grave is referencing a club owner and restaurateur from the 70s and 80s who also happened to be involved in organized crime. And then there's Best Rock Albums of 2013. That's not even in the frame of the decades I thought we were considering here. What are we even doing? Well, this question of focus has hampered the previous two Mountain Goats albums, if we're being candid. The drifting question of what any of this is adding up to, where it might land. But it doesn't bother me nearly as much this time around because A, the pace and the hooks or days are way tighter. If there is some meandering, it feels more atomized and much more digestible. And B, if you take a step back, it makes a peculiar amount of sense. In an excellent interview with Under the Radar, John Darnielle has described the odd compulsion running through a lot of his career in the strange juxtapositions with lyrics that might not seem to mirror the tone of the compositions, all for his own taste, sometimes played for humor, other times for pathos, and in this case, we really get some of all of it. This, by extension, creates that gentle prodding to think through the implication of the juxtaposition. Why do it in this way? What is he trying to say? Especially when there might have been scenes that John Darnielle didn't know or remember as intimately, or observe from a distance, so you might get conflicting reports on those details. It's always been entertaining to question how reliable the narrators are on any Mountain Goats song or album, and Days feels even more challenging in that regard, and how its characters or stories will paint the history around them. Prime example comes with the single Charlie Sheen Reaches Out to the Feds. The story goes that the film critic Chris Gore gave Charlie Sheen a copy of the movie Guinea Pig 2, Flower of Flesh and Blood in the early 90s. And it freaked Charlie Sheen out so much that he was convinced it was a real snuff film, and he contacted the FBI. They reportedly investigated the film's distributor up until the Japanese filmmakers coincidentally put out a documentary that same year describing some of their special effects tricks, which caused the investigation to be dropped, and yet was truly shocking, and it was not mentioned in the song, keep that in mind for later, a couple years earlier in the late 80s, called The Otaku Murderer in Japan, reportedly inspired by some of the kills in this movie, which has also never been fully confirmed, and of which I doubt Charlie Sheen never knew about, and again, the Mountain Goats don't mention it in the song. And he's not the only murderer to go unremarked upon throughout the course of this album. If you've heard about Eddie Nash at all, it might be due to the sketchy ties to the Wonderland murderers in 1981, where he was tried multiple times, and while he did spend time in jail, never for those explicit crimes before he died in 2014. Why the hell would anybody be crying at his grave in the years since, outside of the nascent true crime podcast material who found fresh stuff to talk about? The fascinating sentiment underscoring the song is the protagonist is reconciling with the feeling that it's too late to save anyone, change history one way or the other. To quote John Darnielle's press release on his website for this album, "I got both sad and smitten with wonder by how the past is a place upon which you can both can and can't enact a sort of renovation. Can by changing perspective, can't because you actually can't move any parts around or change anything." And you know, I think he's right. You can't change history. Let's talk about framing it. It's weird to talk about nostalgia, especially as you get older, and especially as a critic of art, presumably an expert, because presumably you're supposed to be above indulging in it. You're supposed to know better. You're supposed to think deeper. You're supposed to have all that historical context. You're supposed to be able to recognize the trick, and while you might applaud, you do not do so rapturously, but with the knowing smile of, I heard what you did there. I'm not going to relitigate old arguments about objective critique with art, given that I already made that video essay 5 years ago. But if I were to humor an argument made in the favor of objective standards, it would be that said critique could stand the test of time. That its set of standards would hold against the changing trends and fads to canonize a lens in which art might be judged. Where surely it would be able to push back against the weight of nostalgia in looking back on things that weren't great at the time and surely would not be great now or in the future. Of course, this doesn't quite work in practice. A lot of those who pronounce objective standards necessarily are going to be hearkening back to historical groundings for their taste, where their tastemakers in their era had their own subjective biases and societal factors that shaped their opinions and that the modern era calling back to them conveniently ignores. Reminds me a lot of the articles that had been printed for over 100 years about the decline of the West or how no young person wants to work anymore. And yet, if you happen to believe that things were better back then, and you're just not aware of what experts said at the time, or you're just operating off of what was popular enough for history to preserve, nostalgia's an easy patina to smooth over even the crap of ages past. And it's probably not even representative of the actual historical opinion of what might have been enshrined as objective. Some of those critics back then may have called it crap now, and yet you're putting it on a pedestal? Now, this is where I could insert all of Orson Welles' F for fake and all that postmodern discourse about expertise and call it a day, but jumping down that rabbit hole misses a root of nostalgia. Like all reactions to art, it's fundamentally emotional, where the feelings seem to strike deeper because they are linked to time's passage, Not just what's perceived as a pure emotional response from days gone by when you knew less but felt more, but also the wistful desire to feel the same again. Going back to that old video essay, one of the points I theorized in the emotional response to art was how we could form a deeper relationship with it beyond that of some people, because art doesn't change. And on a base level, it's a conversation between artist and audience that can make you feel the same again without fail, over and over. That can get extrapolated to the author, and then the desperate hope said author can replicate or restore the feeling, and the more time passes, the more the art and the emotions are enshrined in memory and your response, the deeper the nostalgia will grow. This is why nostalgia is often framed as conservative. It's what built the past, that foundation. It's got value. Looking back on it, that's natural. Makes you feel good. Don't you want to feel the same again? Even if it conveniently skates over some of the bad stuff? Surely we learn from all those mistakes, remember the lessons, and even if we don't learn when we bring it all back, in the end, it's gonna feel the same, right? That's what you want. It's why, in theory, the catchphrase, "I remember it so you don't have to," began as a joke. How it never really was that good looking back, but from the person speaking it, it becomes more tinged with wistful longing for those times and the cruelest of metatextual prophecies for the one who spoke it. Hell, John Darnielle himself has even mentioned in passing how some conservative art can be very good in capturing the emotion of the world changing around those getting older or feeling left behind, not fully grasping what it all means, or getting it and accepting that it'll be something that you're not at this stage of your life. And that can be okay too. But let's take a step back, because thinking about the past, maybe even musing that there were certain things that were better back then, relishing that emotion, at least how you remembered it, that's not an inherently conservative position, even if they try to label and claim it. That's just being human, getting older, reflecting on life. And the follow-through comes if you bring any degree of thought or knowledge or research. That should be the purpose behind the expertise in the first place, from experience. And even if you're just going to purely engage in the art with emotion, the next step is the introspection, to understand why you feel the way you do, how the art made you feel it. It might seem like there's this weird tension for critics that you got the emotional foundation of nostalgia just like everyone else, but you remember enough or you've done enough of the research to register to present a cleaner or more complex version of the history that might contradict some of the emotion that it really wasn't that good. But truthfully, if you understand things and how they affect you emotionally the way they did in the past, and then can reflect upon them nowadays, that you've done the work to look deeper where the emotional through line has faded or remained similar years or decades later, the tension kind of dissipates. And then you can do the more interesting work of questioning how the history or art of the past fits within modern tropes and modern frames, while being emotionally true in your critique, how it's affected you. Now, this is all getting enmeshed in a lot of theory. Let me give you a tangible example, and let's make it metal. One of my early entry points into metal when I was a teenager, Nightwish, and all of their Finnish symphonic metal bombast. They weren't especially respected in the time outside of the scene, but I found them through a lot of connections to fantasy-related music because I was, and still am, a huge nerd, and I fell in love with a lot of the music. They've got classic albums in their scene. Now, about 20 years later, I can go back to some of the old music and still think that it kicks ass. I remember the thrill of listening to something so simultaneously operatic yet heavy as a teenager. They could write hooks like nobody's business. But I can also acknowledge they were a lot more poetic and ambitious lyricists than they occasionally got credit, especially writing with English as their second language. And look, the production leaps that were made across the 2000s, but also how the frontman, Tuomas Holopainen, treated various people within the band, and who could often be his own worst enemy when it comes to self-indulgence, especially in the 2010s and 2020s. Does that temper my nostalgic, emotional response? Sure, but not to the point where I still can't enjoy Wishmaster or Century Child or Dark Passion Play or Imaginarium. Could it also be read as self-justification for emotion in the face of more objective critique? More objective facts and history? Sure, but objectivity based on what set of standards? Can you acknowledge where those standards come from? Or how they could be just as subjective, including every appeal to authority and bias? The point I'm trying to make here is that with more knowledge and context, the emotional experience of nostalgia can become bittersweet. But that might be a better flavor profile than pure saccharin. It demands the complexity and by extension a lot of work to actually get there, and yet that might be the real sticking point for both audiences and critics and artists alike, when it becomes easier to be comfortable rather than keep challenging yourself and moving forward. Especially when you feel like you deserve to rest on legacy, or you're just looking to deliver entertainment at the end of the day. Meet the vast majority of audiences where they are, because they're not thinking that deeply about it. And that's okay. And for audiences, and indeed a lot of artists, it's hard to get angry about settling into the comfort zone, especially if that's where their ambitions have landed. But for critics claiming expertise in the field, you would expect there to be a higher burden. If you claim to be an expert, even within a niche, that necessarily comes with the demand that you keep learning to keep your skill sharp, that iron hones iron, the blade must pass through the fire else it will break, which is all the harder with the march of time when you're playing to the nostalgia of your audience, and that can be more marketable. It's telling when critics stop checking out new artists or genres or sounds, and instead start lionizing the same sounds from the past that get revived due to the cyclical nature of trends and the nostalgia of the masses. And yet rarely you'll see those new acts placed on the same pedestal of those who dominated the critics' past. Let me make a hip-hop comparison. If you claim to be an expert in rap music, how often does your top 5 change to accommodate the new legends that are being written? Even if, like me, you don't want to acknowledge a classic album immediately and be a prisoner of the moment, how often will you change to accommodate acts 5, 10, 20 years later, beyond a token few? How often do those gatekeepers reflexively make excuses to defend the past against evolution or a different lens, or only cover the sounds that fit their expectation rather than the approach with an open mind? That's not an ask for you to adjust your standards, it's accepting the reality that there is so much art being released on a daily basis that if you put in the work, you can find more than you will ever dream that can meet or match it, especially in comparison with some of those legends that are growing long in the tooth. But even then, even if you do the work, I can acknowledge that to some it'll never quite feel the same. It'll hit the right notes, but it doesn't quite feel right. Especially you go back to find an artist who's still delivering something demonstrably weaker than their classics, but still scratches that same comfort zone itch. That's where you run into a very interesting quandary, especially among genres that have an aging audience. The fad or the trend might fade, but the artist is still putting out work in their comfort zone, in their middle age or beyond, and how much institutional support goes into building their pedestals and reviewing the projects that will still sell, maybe as entertainment, but really, how relevant are they to the modern conversation or going forward? I really don't like arguing about the relevance of art because so much of it is completely detached from the art itself. It's tied to what people think of the artist, how much one can activate the fan base, and that speaks to industrial factors, the changing times, whether or not critics care enough to write about it. But if we're gonna have a conversation about nostalgia, it's impossible to ignore that it's way easier for established and especially older critics to write about albums from an old favorite act of theirs rather than someone new. Challenge the status quo. A review that does more to feed search engine optimization that will drive a conversation, especially when those who need that attention more than ever are left increasingly unsupported and unknown because those reviews are not going to drive traffic. And assembling all this in the aftermath of multiple music journalist outlets like Brooklyn Vegan and Alternative Press and Revolver and Goldmine being gutted by Live Nation and a company run by the few members of Good Charlotte, a band at this point whose only success is coming through the nostalgia circuit. There's a bitter tang when the industrial forces of nostalgic entertainment work to crush the writers that would have chronicled them at the time, often not favorably, often for good reason, and the music journalists who are doing yeoman's work trying to tell the story of who comes next. I think it's fair to say John Darnielle has thought through the majority of what I'm describing, not just as an excellent songwriter, but as an artist who has been active for decades, in an act with a storied legacy where I'd be excused for not covering this, especially after the last two albums that may have been considered a bit disappointing. But they're also not quite commercial enough to have the built-in nostalgia draw. This places the Mountain Goats in an ambiguous, occasionally tenuous space, where the framing of history matters, where John Darnielle himself has expressed fondness for some of that bittersweetness, especially when the sweetness can still cut through. So how does that shape Days?
The sky in the morning, when you catch a minute to breathe, the sun on the grass, the wind in your sleeve.
So here's a prime example of framing. The majority of what I just described above, it might be more theoretical, it might be tangled, but the Mountain Goats appear to have considered in the songwriting of Days, especially all that emotional response, not just in the text of the stories they're telling, but the metatext around those stories. And my favorite example comes in the song Best Hard Rock Albums 2013. First thing you'll notice, the sound does not match anything that would be close to the music of that era, or even make that list. I mean, it's not even hard rock, it's closer to the contented burbling of yacht rock with some subtle horns. And when you get to the lyrics, they don't even show any names of an album that would make that list. Not even much in the way of references that I can crack, which has prompted some on the Mountain Goats Reddit as we speak to go digging amidst John Darnielle's list of his favorite albums of that year to find clues about what he's talking about, and they haven't actually had a lot of luck. If anything, the song sounds like the experience of an aging music fan looking up a year-end list amidst a relatively bucolic background, with many a reference to the passage of time around them. The choice to look back on an era that he might know well, but still check out the ones that he might have missed, or not know at all. He's curious. This immediately introduces the context of people who write about music, who would have assembled the list. A critic, a song about who writes the story, and then who reads the story being written. Let's go a level deeper. What were the best rock albums, hard rock albums of 2013? Or really, what were the rock albums that came out that year? Because lists are subjective. I was a critic around that time, one who broadly leaned towards rock music, and one thing you might not remember about that year was just how many legacy rock and metal acts put out albums. And knowing the demographic of rock music critics of that era, especially the older ones, the overlap between the heydays of decades past and what they did in 2013 means a couple of the artists showed up again and again. If we just stick to grunge, both Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains put out reasonably well-received albums that year. I still think Pearl Jam's Lightning Bolt is really underrated to this day. And yet what's fun is going even further with a wider look at genre. Helloween, Motorhead, Dream Theater, Queensryche, Dark Throne, Death Angel, and in a glorious 1-2 punch, both Black Sabbath and especially Deep Purple put out some of their best work in decades in 2013. I'd argue that Now What by Deep Purple deserves to be among the best albums of the 2010s and one of the best in their catalog. But it's a revealing point. A list of the best hard rock albums of 2013 is probably populated by a lot of acts that could have made that list in 93. Or 83, or even 73. If I look back on my own list of albums that year, many of the top picks, especially around rock or metal, were from acts with well-established legacies, often decades in. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, The National, Queens of the Stone Age, Ayreon if we're looking more towards metal, and if we're tilting towards how I might revise it over a decade later, going towards singer-songwriters like the Mountain Goats, and a couple of years removed from the Drive-By Truckers, we got Jason Isbell. Hell, in 2013, what many would consider one of the best rap albums of that year came from Run the Jewels. A pairing of two well-established rappers in Killer Mike and LP who would see their most success together as a duo and already had pioneered the formula thanks to LP's production on 2012's rap music for Killer Mike. Hell, if I wanted to get really meta about it, I could highlight that 3 years ago, I did a series of video essays explicitly exploring the music of 2013, and in the case of the Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds piece around Push the Sky Away, it was explicitly exploring metatext. Think about the layers here. In discussing a song, discussing a list from 2013, my discussion here turns inevitably into a rediscussion of an album that's all about discussing its own creation. Now, note the actual list of albums dropped that year did not change. History's not been revised. Nobody went back in time to sneak out a previously unheard album in 2013. Because you know who did not put out an album this year? The Mountain Goats. But the way in which we framed the conversation, especially as a critic, that's changed, as have the audiences that might engage with a list written in 2013 or 1 years later. For a brief tangent, one thing I actually really respect about Robert Christgau's method of making year-end lists is he doesn't specifically time box them rigidly, and thus he's more fluid in updating or tweaking them all the time, but he's also not showy about changing any orders. How the list itself is more serving as a living document because nobody can get to anything in a given year, and opinions and time changes. Although in this case, there's an added level of irony because I don't even think he likes hard rock that much. But I dearly love how the Mountain Goats keep it grounded by not reflecting on all the overthinking I just did right here for the past couple of minutes to get more meta about it, which is also more of the reality of how people actually engage with lists like this, as you would get from the sound, and how much of any of it is really remembered clearly at all, or how much the societal context starts blurring, becomes the emotional foundation of, well, what folks want it to be. Nostalgia. It's interesting how much of the album mentions documentation or analog tapes recording, because you can capture specific scenes, but everything else around them that informs them, the mechanisms of culture and personality and history that shape them, that provide the past and the future that's out of frame, what makes the final cut, that's up to the filmmaker, or the writer, or the critic making the YouTube video. And that gives us, well, about as much responsibility as we want to take, especially around what context we choose to add. Here's another prime example. The way the Mountain Goats frame the 3 sold-out performances at Carnegie Hall by the 70s prog band Renaissance, it's triumphant, a landmark often overlooked for a British cult band that had some success in America, where they played their crossover hit, not Northern Lights. That song would come out in 1978, which was certainly after the 1976 live album, probably would have been Mother Russia, and then the nearly 29-minute suite Song of Scheherazade, which makes me smile, because that's a song about a legendary storyteller who enraptured a sultan that he made her his queen after 1,001 tales, a deliberate metatextual moment about the power of art's conversation that outside of a moment would not be reflected for Renaissance itself as the band would continue. What might be more telling is that the final song from that Live in Carnegie Hall album is Ashes Are Burning, a 23-minute suite all about the hazy passage of time, and then my mind drifts to the line from Billy Woods' Spider Hole from 2019's Hiding Places. I don't want to see Nas perform with an orchestra at Carnegie Hall. You realize that for one moment in culture, it's glorious. It enshrines a legacy that might be preserved. It might be the highest moment. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. For another, it might reflect the same to the artist, performing alongside Jay-Z in 2012 in Carnegie Hall, but also one's legacy being sold, ossified, divorced from culture. It's amazing the little differences that manifest between what a performance can mean and how it is framed and told. Because memory is a fickle thing, where the emotional experience might trend towards nostalgia about every glance just outside the frame, and for as often as they prompt one to examine the frame, it's a little bit alarming when you see what's just in the frame taken as is. To quote Pitchfork's review, no longer content just getting us to root for the vivid, weary underdogs, Darnielle, with the help of his band, is now wringing out fondness for the winners and sellouts, the days of idle pleasure in which nothing much occurred. And I can't help but think this is really missing the forest for the trees right from the opening track. If you know anything about Layne Staley's life and his tragic death from heroin addiction, wasn't a lot of winning that went on there. and I think he would have admitted it too. Woodstock 99 blurs together references of the two Woodstock revival festivals in the 90s, and while the quiet swell of the song tries to evoke good memories of what it all could mean in frame, very relevant given how many music journalists of that time lined up to do the same in the late 90s tradition of searching for meaning at the end of the millennium, and it's a shirtless frontman yelling about cocaine, which some have ascribed to being Buck Cherry singing Lit Up. I mean, I don't know in 2026 who's going to go to bat for the band that wrote Crazy Bitch and call them winners. If there was a win, it certainly did not last. Is that what matters there? The wins lasting or just in the moment? Candlebox is a story about a fictional act that peaked touring with the titular band. Sure, there's some wistful desire to recreate that and do it all again after Ben ran off with all the money the first time. Maybe they could forgive him, recapture that moment of glory again. But if they were to do it all again, it would not feel the same. They're no longer young. Hell, Candlebox wouldn't even be the same. The only consistent members of that band right now are the frontman and the lead guitarist, and the latter took a solid decade off from them. The closest to a song for the winners that we get here is Growing To Fennario, commemorating the passage of the late Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead. And funny thing, it's a relatively unassuming folk song full of niche references to the Grateful Dead that is remarkably candid about life's passage and death. Almost winsome in how one chooses to make their exit. Unassuming even. If it's a win, it's a quiet one. I could say it ends in assassination, but you'd have to go back to 2017 to get that reference. And if there is a thematic through line with Days, it's the pensive reconciliation with time itself. The desire to savor more the little things because you've got no real control of how your legacy is canonized. I've already referenced Shelley's poem Ozymandias, as Darnielle has in interviews around this album, because there's truth. That grandeur in the expanse of time might just wind up lost amidst the drifting sands. That context collapses and history blurs and libraries burn, and even those who write the history wind up bending its frame according to their reality that it might not even be true or just emotionally true to them. I've talked a lot about the responsibility of the storytellers in doing so, but the reality is that both storytellers and artists and the audience may feel their names forgotten, so why not hold on to what you have now, what you think you know? This is where I could reference F for Fake again, and the grandeur of the cathedral with no known architect and the quiet moment of Orson Welles' monologues. But to quote the subject of my last video essay and get all the more meta about it, again, another album all about the power of the camera, no one lasts forever. Of course, that frame belies a certain amount of power to hold and enjoy it. History is often written by the victors, the ones who have the money to prescribe themselves as such, the ones higher up in the hierarchy, and thus power begets memory, where even if there's a misunderstanding, it can prompt fond emotion, or the shallow graves to be dug up from within or without. But Darnielle is savvy enough to know that's no guarantee. That's bittersweet in its own right. And that takes us to the penultimate song, Hidden Majesty of later Venom albums. For those of you who don't know, Venom is one of the bands that pioneered specific elements of heavy metal in the early 80s. You can argue they are integral to the story of metal if you want to tell it right. But their story doesn't end there. Just because a genre or scene has decided that your time is up doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. And Venom's story gets real twisted and weird from then on. True story, I remember seeing Venom live in September 2018 at Coalition, a now closed Toronto metal bar. I remember being excited, but not exactly impressed by the results, as the song seems to signify. But that's because I'm lying, and it wasn't actually Venom, but Venom Inc., a band with a few of Venom's former members recalling the 1989 lineup. I mean, it was my own fault for not doing the research. The fall of 2018 was pretty rough for me. I broke my elbow falling off a bike going to that same bar for a midweek show just a couple days later. I've got the videos to prove it. But getting down to the Mountain Goat song, which literally references coming to Canada for shows, there is something very reminiscent of Goths in the track, especially the context of memory. The moment may have passed, but you're still here. The audience seems to ever shrink, but there's enough that will show up, might even make it worth it. Even if you're not as good as you once were, or if you were never quite as good at all as everyone seems to think that you were, and anyone that would follow, and few that seem to care anymore, there is a certain majesty in doing what you do best for yourself, and knowing that's enough. Very few are going back to write about or review late-period Venom albums. Even the historians of rock music fanatics who love to elevate long-running legacy. And there's a certain poignancy in then having the freedom to do whatever you want. There's no gatekeepers left. Let the production get a little weird. Even if at the core you're still mostly the same. The world just moved, as it always does. The last time I was this positively pensive about a Mountain Goats album was Goths in 2017. And while I was a very different person than I was 9 years ago, the odd thing about being a music critic for this long, having seen many rise and fall on this platform and others, is that if you manage to maintain your archive, your history is always close at hand. Where I don't just remember what I've said, but I'm spurred to remember why I said it. Where I was in that place, how I felt when I said it, how I felt when I wrote it. I've written about thousands of albums, I've made thousands of videos. Most won't do any one passion project in their lives for as long as I've been doing this. And few have chronicled it as extensively in an internet that feels more fleeting and fragmented by the day. And for what end? Unless the hubris has me thinking it'll be such an end to be worthy of remembrance. It makes for a weird creative experience to have spent so much of this year changing my format and seeing new audiences discover what I do, and then openly wonder, where the hell has this guy been? Why isn't he more famous? He's kind of pretentious and self-important, but he's stuck around this long. It's got to mean something. Whereas for me, I've been here the whole time. The reality is that I've lasted on this platform a lot longer than many would allocate. Longer than the majority of critics who will ever write about music, with plenty of mistakes along the way. I cite 2019 as the point where, between Patreon screwing up my shift in my billing and scheduling format when I took back control for my own sanity, and then moving Billboard Breakdown onto its own side channel to deal with copyright, thus collapsing the primary view trajectory on the main channel, and then YouTube effectively decided to stop surfacing my video in the majority of algorithms. I mean, that probably should have been my sign to quit altogether. But for as pensive and reflective as I might be about the passage of time in 2026, and the quiet running theme of a lot of this year and a lot of my content, I'm not about to let the algorithm decide when I'm done. And paradoxically, it's been my best year on this platform yet, and the days have felt longer still. Is this my late Venom period? Or am I just waiting to wind up on somebody's best list? Or is it all just a blur? Or rather, a daze? The last song on the new Mountain Goats album is called Last Day. It's quick, it's jaunty, honestly a little bit jarringly upbeat as a closing track if you didn't really fully grasp the rest of the album, where for as much as you think you know what's coming after, you really don't. Where amidst a callback to 2021's Dark in Here, it's still a shade bittersweet, but more for the question of what taste will be left upon the tongue. How much will be left behind, if anything? It's a poignant moment of conclusion, where that if you go by the text, you really can't say what's next. All that's really there is to recognize how it necessarily must end. Abruptly.